Hi, thanks for joining us today for this brief Rhetorica session at the desk with a communication expert. Today's expert is Dr. Tony Jaques. Tony is an internationally recognised expert on issue and crisis management and is the author of the book Don't Just Stand There, a book about issue and crisis management. He lectures at the master's program in issue and crisis communication at RMIT, is on several editorial boards, a frequent public speaker, writes a terrific, is it weekly or monthly, Tony, your newsletter?
Twice monthly.
Twice monthly, a terrific newsletter. You can sign up for that at issueoutcomes.com.au, is that right?
Absolutely.
And a great guy. Tony, thanks for spending a few minutes with us today.
It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Tony, it seems that what you're saying is that crisis management needs to move along, it has moved along, and that there's quite a difference and a call now for more focus on crisis prevention as opposed to crisis management. Is that right? And if so, tell us what all that's about.
Yeah, the key to this is to understand the difference between crisis response, which is what you do when things go bad, and crisis management overall, which is preparing for it and helping to prevent it. Let me give you an example. Most of us think it's a good idea to insure our houses against fire and flood and burglary, but of course insurance only takes effect if you've been burgled or you had a fire. So what most people do is they take preventative measures. They put in smoke alarms and they put in fire alarms and they put deadlocks on the doors. So they're both preparing for the crisis and also preparing what happens after it occurs. Now, exactly the same thing happens for corporations. Many big organisations put in place a great response program. They put in place teams of people, crisis training, manuals and simulations. And those things are very, very important. They're like the insurance policy. They're what you do when you had a crisis. But none of that helps you prevent the crisis happening in the first place. And so what's emerging now is a new approach which says, do all those things, they're really, really important, but you need to also be taking preventive measures to say, not only what will we do when a crisis strikes us, but how can we reduce the chances of it happening in the first place?
Tony, at the risk of saying something really uneducated, a lot of that seems like common sense. I imagine that might seem like common sense to a layperson who goes, well, sure, if you're a BP or a petrochemical company, it's not just about managing the media when it hits the fan. It's certainly about safety and processes and preventative action prior. Isn't that already happening?
It does seem like just common sense. And yes, in some places it is already happening. But the sad thing about it, Antoni, is this, that many, many companies don't do it. There's been research done in Australia, around the world, where they talk to companies and say, what systems have you got in place? And the answer is that consistently around about 50% of all companies don't actually have anything much in place to help prevent a crisis happening in the first place. And that's because, well, there's lots of reasons. It's difficult, it's awkward, it's sometimes a bit embarrassing, it doesn't seem like a priority, so nothing happens. Tony, and then when a crisis does strike, people say, oh yes, we should have done those things a long time ago.
Are there segments of the corporate arena where that is happening better or worse than in others?
For big organisations, which have got a lot of resources and infrastructure, there is a tendency to do this better. They understand risks. People like airlines, banks, insurance companies, shipping companies, transportation companies, they see this pretty obviously and they do good things usually at a corporate level. But here's the problem. Even those big companies tend to put their effort into what I call natural risk. In other words, it's the risks which are associated with that company. So an airline company, for example, is going to be very well prepared for an aeroplane crashing. And a bank will be pretty well prepared for a breach of security, or maybe a customer arriving at the bank wearing a balaclava and making a very large unauthorised withdrawal.
Yeah.
But the problem is this. that those same big companies don't put the same effort into what might be called the more generic risks, like employee dishonesty,
The health
sexual
department in
harassment.
Queensland, for example.
The situation which has just very recently occurred with the Department of Health in Queensland is a very good example of how individuals' actions can affect an organisation which might have been looking at the obvious risks and not the risks which are created by employees. In that case, an employee's been arrested for very large fraud. The case hasn't yet gone to court and we don't know what the answer will be. But what we do know is that as a result of that arrest, the Premier of the state has announced that she's going to virtually abolish the entire department, and 3 senior managers have been stood down, and the reputation of the organisation has been trashed, irrespective of whether or not the individual is found guilty or not guilty, which will happen many months down the track. And this is not uncommon, that the actions of individuals can bring down organisations.
Yeah.
There was a report just recently, just earlier this month, of a big building company in Australia which has run into huge credit problems and is forced to look for a buyer. And according to the news reports, that was because a former employee failed to send out over 200 invoices for creditors who owed them money, and as a result, the company ran into an enormous credit problem, and now the bank is forcing them to try and look for a purchaser.
Yeah.
So my point is that big organisations like airlines and so on, hospitals, will look at the obvious risks, and most of us know what those are going to be. They're very simple.
Yeah.
But they don't look at all the other risks, and they don't realise how those other risks can in fact be more dangerous and more damaging than the obvious ones.